evening air in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead carried a brittle chill, slipping through the lace curtains of Lady Davenport's stately manor with a ghostly insistence. Inside, the grand drawing-room was alive with the gentle hum of conversation and the faint clinking of silver spoons against porcelain cups. But the serenity of the gathering was shattered when a piercing scream cut through the polite chatter, sending the assembled guests into a sudden, startled silence. Lady Davenport herself stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, her pale hands trembling as she clutched the banister. At the centre of the turmoil lay the body of her young niece, Eleanor Renford, sprawled unnaturally on the intricately patterned rug, a single white glove clutched tightly in her lifeless hand. The police were called immediately, and the inspector arrived with an air of practised severity. But it was clear from the first moments that this was no ordinary crime. The room had been locked from the inside, every window was latched, and the heavy oak door bore no sign of forced entry. Nothing had been disturbed except Eleanor herself, and yet her presence there, lifeless and unprotected, suggested a struggle that left no visible trace. The usual signs, footprints, fingerprints, a weapon, were nowhere to be found. Instead, atop the grand piano, someone had left a single, small envelope, addressed in a delicate, looping hand. "Read me before you judge." Miss Marple arrived quietly the following morning, having been summoned by Lady Davenport herself. The elderly sleuth, with her unassuming frame and sharp, penetrating eyes, took in the scene without comment, her mind already cataloguing details that others overlooked. She observed the careful placement of the furniture, the direction in which the curtains fell, and the subtle scuff marks on the polished floor. Small inconsistencies that to most would seem trivial, but to her spoke volumes. Sitting gracefully in the armchair where Eleanor's body had been discovered, she reached for the envelope and broke the seal. Inside, the letter was brief, yet it carried a peculiar weight. "I know they will suspect the obvious, but truth is never obvious. Look beyond the surface. Seek what cannot be seen." It was the cryptic nature of the note that intrigued Miss Marple most. The local inspector was flustered, insisting on conventional motives, jealousy, inheritance, a lover's quarrel. But Miss Marple, with her keen sense of human nature, knew better. Eleanor's death, she suspected, was an invitation to the mind, a puzzle deliberately constructed to mislead and confuse. She walked slowly around the room, noting the slight dusting on the piano keys, as though someone had played them recently, leaving only the faintest traces of impression. A teacup, still warm, rested on a side table, suggesting a brief, recent presence in the room. Yet none of these clues formed a coherent narrative on their own. The room was a canvas of half-truths and deliberate obfuscation. Lady Davenport, still draped in mourning, followed Miss Marple through the manor, her voice trembling as she recounted Eleanor's final hours. "She was to be married in 2 weeks, Lady Davenport said, wringing her hands. "We dined together last night, and she was as lively as ever. She spoke of nothing troubling, nothing at all. How could this have happened?" Her eyes, wide and desperate, sought reassurance in the detective's calm demeanour, but Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, as if the gears of her mind turned with a quiet insistence. The first breakthrough came when Miss Marple examined the letter again, her attention drawn not to the words themselves but to the stationery and the ink. The paper was of a kind sold only in a small shop across the village, a shop Eleanor had visited the previous day. The ink, slightly faded in one corner, suggested a hurried, almost clandestine writing. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the glove in Eleanor's hand, pristine and white, as though it had been handled by someone with deliberate care. "Curious," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else, "that the only trace left by the perpetrator is this single, perfect artifact." She spoke little as she moved through the manor, but her mind worked tirelessly. Miss Marple questioned the household staff one by one, observing subtle hesitations, fleeting expressions, the way their eyes darted under pressure. Nothing seemed incriminating at first glance. The cook, the housemaid, even the gardener, all spoke in unison about Eleanor's cheerful disposition and her upcoming wedding. Yet it was in their silences, the small omissions, that Miss Marple began to see the outlines of a more intricate design. By mid-afternoon she requested to examine Eleanor's personal quarters. The room was neat, almost antiseptically arranged, But Miss Marple noticed one detail that had eluded everyone, a faint indentation on the writing desk, suggesting that a small book or notebook had been recently removed. Inside the drawer she found a diary, its pages filled with the meticulous thoughts of a young woman, alternating between excitement and a subtle, unspoken fear. The entries hinted at secret meetings, cryptic messages received at odd hours, and fleeting glimpses of a man who had seemingly vanished from her life as suddenly as he appeared. Each page deepened the mystery, suggesting that the crime was not random, nor purely violent. It was personal, calculated, and precise. Evening fell, and Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, her mind assembling the puzzle piece by piece. She traced the positions of the guests from the previous night, noting who had been nearest to Eleanor, who had moved unnoticed, and who had opportunities masked by distractions. Then finally, she requested Lady Davenport's company for a quiet conversation, away from the probing eyes of the household. She spoke gently, almost conversationally, yet her questions struck directly at the heart of hidden motives and unspoken truths. Lady Davenport, after a long pause, confessed that Eleanor had been engaged in correspondence with someone the family did not trust, a distant cousin, whose presence in the manor was officially documented, but whose activities remained largely unseen. The revelation was subtle, not explosive, yet it cast new light on the previous night's events. Miss Marple returned to the crime scene once more, her eyes lingering on the piano, the white glove, the small envelope. Each was a deliberate signal, a misdirection crafted to draw attention away from the truth. The real clue, she realized, lay not in what was present, but in what was conspicuously absent, the diary that had been removed earlier. Someone had known of Eleanor's premonition-like entries, had read them, and had moved to silence the young woman before she could reveal the full story. And yet, in the careful, almost artful placement of the envelope, they had inadvertently provided the key to the unraveling of the mystery. By nightfall, the inspector returned to hear Miss Marple's initial assessment. She spoke quietly, almost hesitantly, yet with an authority that could not be dismissed. The crime was not about rage or impulse, she said. It was a message, a carefully curated performance. The person responsible sought to mislead, to obscure, yet left the very thread that will unravel the truth. Her eyes met the inspector's, calm but piercing. And that thread, she added, gesturing to the diary and the envelope, is all we need to begin to understand the crime. Outside, the wind pressed against the manor's windows with a sibilant insistence, as though echoing the secrets now stirring within. The mystery, though still unsolved, had begun to yield its first truths, not through brute force or hasty conclusions, but through careful observation, patience, and a profound understanding of human nature. Miss Marple, quietly confident, prepared herself for the next step, aware that every detail, however small, was a whisper pointing toward the eventual resolution of Lady Davenport's bride's haunting confession. Morning arrived over St. Mary Mead with a soft, misty light that barely penetrated the high windows of Lady Davenport's manor. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with quiet tension. Servants moved silently, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shock of the previous night's tragedy. Miss Marple had spent the early hours walking the corridors alone, her keen eyes scanning each detail with the patience and precision of a surgeon. Where others saw only grief and disorder, she discerned subtle irregularities. Dust disturbed in unusual patterns, the faintest smudge along a windowsill, a misplaced trinket that seemed out of place among the carefully curated decor. Every small anomaly was catalogued in her mind, forming a mental map of the room as it had been, as it was, and, perhaps, as it should not have been. When the inspector arrived to resume questioning, he brought with him the usual array of methodical procedures, photographing the scene, measuring distances, and checking alibis. He was meticulous in his work, but his mind remained confined to conventional lines of reasoning. Miss Marple allowed him to proceed, quietly observing how he interpreted, or rather misinterpreted, the clues. She noticed the way he seemed to overlook the envelope atop the piano, regarding it merely as a curiosity, rather than the deliberate signal she suspected it to be. It was a small oversight, but to her it was significant. The envelope was a silent communicator, placed to misdirect and to taunt anyone who would follow the obvious path. Her attention shifted to the white glove Eleanor had clutched, Unlike the other artifacts of the scene, it seemed almost pristine, its fabric untouched by struggle, yet it bore a faint scent, subtle, floral, slightly metallic, evidence that it had been handled recently, but not by Eleanor herself. Miss Marple's mind ticked over the possibilities. Someone had left it deliberately, as if to say, "Look here, but not there." She picked up the glove carefully, noting the slight wear at the fingertips. Whoever had placed it had understood the importance of attention to detail, of creating a trace that appeared meaningful, yet led nowhere. It was, she thought, a masterstroke of misdirection. She then turned her gaze toward the fireplace. The hearth had been recently used, though there was no immediate sign of disturbance. A faint ash pattern suggested something, or someone, had been in close proximity, shifting lightly as if balancing weight on one foot more than the other. Nearby, a small fragment of lace, almost invisible against the polished wooden floor, caught her attention. Miss Marple leaned closer, gently lifting it with a gloved finger. It was not part of Eleanor's attire, nor any garment she had seen in the household. A fragment so tiny might have been dismissed by others, but to her it hinted at someone present in the room whose movements had been deliberately masked. Her thoughts were interrupted by Lady Davenport herself, who appeared hesitant, almost reluctant to intrude upon the detective's quiet concentration. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I can hardly bear to ask, but do you see anything yet?" There was a tremor in her voice, a mixture of desperation and trust. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes never leaving the fragment of lace. "Patience, my dear. The truth seldom rushes, but it reveals itself to those who notice what others do not." The inspector, meanwhile, was questioning the household staff. Their responses were polished, rehearsed even, each denying any unusual activity or knowledge of visitors beyond what had been officially recorded. But Miss Marple noticed inconsistencies that went unnoticed by the inspector. The housemaid, for instance, claimed to have been arranging flowers in the conservatory the entire evening, yet the petals on one side of the drawing-room table were slightly disturbed, suggesting a brief presence elsewhere. The gardener insisted he had retired to the greenhouse early, but the mud smudges near the back corridor were fresh and matched a boot not registered in the household. Each lie was subtle, a small deviation from truth, yet enough to indicate someone was masking movements with care. Miss Marple requested to see Eleanor's correspondence again, particularly the letter she had found the previous day. She examined the stationery, the style of handwriting, and even the pressure applied to the paper. One letter, folded neatly and placed in the wastebasket of Eleanor's desk, had been partially torn, as if someone had attempted to destroy its contents. With meticulous care, she retrieved the remnants, piecing together fragments of words. Meet, night, trust, only you, danger. The fragmentary message suggested secretive rendezvous, and perhaps a warning, a glimpse of tension that Eleanor had either feared to reveal or had not yet disclosed fully. Her attention returned to the room itself, noting the interplay of shadows cast by the morning light through the high windows. One corner, near the grand piano, was darker than the others, the carpet slightly indented, almost as if a chair had been moved hastily. She crouched, inspecting the fibres, and found another small clue. A thread, twisted and fraying, unlike the usual weave of the carpet. It matched the colour of the lace fragment she had discovered earlier. The connection was subtle, but unmistakable. Someone had been present here, moving stealthily, leaving behind evidence designed to escape ordinary scrutiny. Miss Marple then spoke to Lady Davenport quietly about Eleanor's acquaintances. The young bride-to-be had been cautious in her friendships, selective in her confidences, and had spoken little of her personal correspondences. Yet the detective sensed that Eleanor had confided in one person, someone who could move unnoticed within the household. A cousin, perhaps, or a family friend of whom the staff spoke with undue certainty, offering alibis that were too complete to be entirely true. Miss Marple's mind began forming a pattern, connecting the fragments of lace, the glove, the traces near the fireplace, and the torn letter. Each point on its own was trivial, but together they hinted at a clandestine presence, a mind carefully orchestrating the crime, and a message embedded in the smallest of gestures. By late morning, Miss Marple requested a brief walk outside, ostensibly to clear her head. Yet even as she moved along the manicured paths of the manor grounds, her eyes took in the minutiae. footprints partially obscured by dew, an overturned flower pot at the edge of the hedgerow, a discarded envelope half buried in the gravel. Each observation fed into her growing awareness that the scene of the crime extended beyond the confines of the manor itself. The perpetrator had not only created a tableau inside the house, but had also considered the surroundings as part of the deception. Returning indoors, she addressed the inspector with a calm authority. "The ordinary view will not solve this," she said. "There are layers here, an intention to mislead, to draw the eye towards certain objects, while masking the true narrative. Observe, but do not assume. Question, but do not accept answers at face value. The first signs of deception are always subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they are the keys to understanding the whole." The inspector, though polite, seemed unsure, glancing at her with a mixture of admiration and confusion. Miss Marple, however, had already begun constructing the web in her mind. The lace and glove, the partial letter, the disturbed carpet, and the shadows, they were not random. They were deliberate, and they pointed towards someone intimately familiar with the household and Eleanor's movements. As the day drew on, she requested to speak with each guest individually, noting reactions, pauses, and shifts in demeanour. Some were naturally anxious, others simply sad, but a few displayed something more, a fleeting flicker of unease that betrayed awareness, or perhaps guilt, in ways the inspector had not detected. Miss Marple catalogued each reaction, connecting them like threads, imagining the sequence of events not as they appeared in isolation, but as part of a larger choreography of deception. Somewhere in these behaviours lay the truth, concealed beneath layers of civility and carefully maintained appearances. By dusk, the house had settled into a brittle quiet once more. Miss Marple stood alone in the drawing-room, revisiting the key points of her observations. She moved the glove carefully across the piano top, aligning it with the lace fragment and the faint shadows she had noticed earlier. Slowly, deliberately, the outlines of the first coherent pattern began to emerge. She could not yet name the perpetrator, but she understood the method, the subtle, almost invisible threads linking the victim, the objects, and the household itself. It was the work of someone clever, attentive, and precise, and yet even they had left traces that no one else would perceive but her. Outside, the last of the evening light faded, casting long, wavering shadows through the tall windows. Inside, Miss Marple prepared for the next phase of her investigation, certain that the morning's observations had laid the foundation for uncovering the carefully concealed truth. Each object, each hesitation, each fragment of lace was a signpost pointing toward the hidden narrative, and she was ready to follow it wherever it led. The first signs of deception had been detected, and with them the path towards solving Lady Davenport's bride's haunting mystery had begun. Miss Marple began her questioning with a calm, almost casual approach, but beneath her gentle demeanour lay the sharp precision of a mind accustomed to peeling back layers of pretense. The first to be questioned was the housemaid Clara, a young woman with pale, nervous features and eyes that darted too quickly from one object to another. She recounted the evening with careful, measured words. She had been in the kitchen preparing the supper tray, then arranging flowers in the conservatory, and had only glimpsed Eleanor briefly as she passed the drawing-room. Miss Marple listened quietly, nodding, her eyes following Clara's hands, the way they twisted a stray strand of hair, the subtle tremor in her voice when she mentioned seeing the envelope on the piano. "Was anyone else in the drawing-room while you passed?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but unwavering. Clara hesitated, lowering her gaze. I don't think so," she murmured. Her reluctance was fleeting, but enough to register in Miss Marple's keen perception. There was something unspoken, a detail she wished to withhold, and Miss Marple made a note of it silently. She would return to it later, when the threads of truth were ready to be disentangled. Next came the gardener, Mr. Hargreaves, a man of imposing stature, but slow, deliberate speech. He maintained that he had retired early, tending to the greenhouse until dusk, and had then walked directly to the servants' quarters. Yet when Miss Marple asked about the small footprints near the back corridor, his brow furrowed slightly. I may have stepped out to check on the rose beds," he admitted after a moment, though his voice betrayed defensiveness. "But only briefly, and I made no further contact with anyone. Miss Marple inclined her head, noting the subtle contradiction. The footprints indicated someone had lingered, and the frayed lace fragment suggested close proximity to Eleanor. Hargreaves' eagerness to absolve himself clashed with the physical evidence. The cook, Mrs. Whitcomb, was next, a rotund, cheerful woman whose initial composure seemed unshakable. Yet when questioned about her movements, she hesitated over small details. She insisted she had been in the kitchen all evening, preparing the supper tray and ensuring the staff had attended to the dining room. "I saw nothing amiss," she claimed firmly, yet her hands twitched as she rearranged the folds of her apron. Miss Marple observed these micro-expressions carefully. They were not overt lies, but hints of unease, subtle markers of either hidden knowledge or fear of revealing something that should remain concealed. As the morning passed into afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Lady Davenport herself to recount the evening once more. The lady's account was polished, precise, and almost theatrical in its delivery. She spoke of Eleanor's cheerfulness, the brief conversation with certain guests, and the sudden scream that had heralded discovery, of the body. Yet Miss Marple noticed fleeting inconsistencies, the timing of when she had seen Eleanor last, the direction she claimed to have run when hearing the scream, and the way she described the envelope atop the piano. Each small deviation from earlier statements was a clue in itself. It suggested either a lapse in memory, common in moments of trauma, or the careful shaping of narrative to conceal elements better left hidden. The first guest to be questioned was a distant cousin, Geoffrey Renford, whose relationship with Eleanor had been cordial but distant, according to Lady Davenport. Geoffrey spoke with a calm authority, offering detailed accounts of his whereabouts. Yet his eagerness to provide an alibi struck Miss Marple as unusual. He described leaving the drawing-room for a stroll around the gardens shortly before the scream, and then returning promptly when summoned by the staff. Yet Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes lingered on the envelope when it was mentioned, a brief but telling pause. He did not outright lie, but he registered far too much interest in a detail that, to the unobservant, would have seemed trivial. The final interview of the afternoon involved Eleanor's fiancé, Edward Carstone, a man of steady composure and polite manner. He recounted his last conversation with Eleanor, emphasizing her joy and excitement for the impending wedding. Yet Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension in his voice, an avoidance of certain topics. When she asked whether Eleanor had confided any worries, his gaze momentarily flicked toward the grand piano, and his answer came carefully measured. "No, she was quite happy, I assure you." Miss Marple's mind noted the hesitation, linking it with the torn fragments of the letter, the secret meetings Eleanor had hinted at, and the subtle disturbances in the drawing-room. Something was being withheld, a critical piece of the puzzle obscured by well-practiced restraint. As each individual recounted events, Miss Marple made careful comparisons, noting discrepancies, hesitations, and over-eager explanations. The fragments of truth were interwoven with carefully constructed narratives, a tapestry of deception meant to obscure the real course of events. Clara had shifted her story about the brief sighting of Eleanor. Hargreaves had understated his presence near the back corridor. Mrs. Whitcomb had overemphasized her attention to tasks, masking any unintended observation. Lady Davenport had altered the sequence of minor actions, while Geoffrey and Edward had both displayed subtle but revealing reactions to seemingly incidental objects and mentions. Each of these inconsistencies alone might have been dismissed, but together they formed a pattern Miss Marple could not ignore. By late afternoon, Miss Marple asked for a brief moment of quiet to review her notes. Alone in the drawing-room, she revisited each witness's statements, lining them up against the physical evidence. The white glove, the lace fragment, the envelope on the piano, the faint footprints, the disturbed carpet fibres. She began to see which narratives aligned with the truth, and which were contrived, subtly or overtly. The threads of deception were starting to fray, revealing glimpses of the underlying reality. Eleanor had interacted with someone who was both present in the household and unknown to most, someone whose actions were calculated to mislead and confuse. Miss Marple's mind returned to the partially destroyed letter she had reconstructed. The phrases about secret meetings, warnings, and trust suddenly gained new weight. Someone within the manor had been watching Eleanor closely, aware of her activities, and had acted to silence her before she could reveal too much. The witnesses' varied accounts, each with its own minor discrepancies, pointed toward an orchestrated concealment of the truth rather than impulsive chaos. The deception was deliberate, layered, and cunning, relying on both human and physical misdirection. The final observation of the day came from the subtle interactions between the staff and the household members. Miss Marple noted a fleeting exchange between Clara and Mrs. Whitcomb as they passed in the corridor. A quick glance, almost imperceptible, a shared knowledge neither spoke aloud. Such moments were easily dismissed by the casual observer, but to Miss Marple they spoke volumes about unspoken alliances, hidden anxieties, and protective instincts that might mask culpability or conceal involvement. By evening, the investigation had reached a point of clarity, though not yet resolution. Miss Marple stood in the drawing-room, surrounded by the artefacts of both crime and concealment. The witnesses had spoken, each presenting a carefully curated version of events, yet their subtle contradictions and the nervous hesitations revealed the presence of deeper motives. Hidden beneath their words were fears, loyalties, and perhaps guilt, threads that could unravel the carefully constructed facade of innocence. Miss Marple knew that the path forward would require patience and precision, following these subtle cues, listening to the unspoken, and allowing the truth to emerge naturally from the contradictions, silences, and fleeting signals left behind. Outside, dusk settled once more over St. Mary Mead, casting the manor in shadowed, muted light. Inside, the web of deception was growing more discernible, and Miss Marple, ever patient and observant, prepared herself for the delicate work of untangling it. Each voice she had heard, each statement offered, had left traces of intent and truth hidden within the gaps. The investigation was no longer about simply reconstructing events. It was about understanding the motivations and secrets that guided them, and somewhere among these carefully veiled truths lay the key to uncovering Lady Davenport's bride's haunting mystery. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet contemplation, seated by the window of the drawing-room with a cup of tea cooling in her hand. The early light revealed the manor in all its precise yet imposing detail, every surface polished, every shadow accentuated, every small object in its place, or so it seemed. The investigation had reached a stage where observation alone could not unravel the threads. Now she needed to understand the hearts behind the deception. Each witness, each member of the household possessed a reason, a motive, however tangled, to have acted in the events that led to Eleanor's death. But unlike a simple crime of passion or opportunity, these motives were layered, conflicting, and intentionally obscured, a maze of intention she would need to navigate carefully. She began with the most obvious of motives: greed. Eleanor's engagement to Edward Carston had secured not just her future, but also certain inheritances and privileges within the family estate. Lady Davenport had been generous in her intentions, but there were distant relatives who might benefit from disruption, from a tragedy that shifted attention or delayed the forthcoming marriage. Geoffrey Renford, in particular, had been mentioned frequently in Eleanor's correspondence, visiting the manor under the guise of family ties, yet displaying an unusual interest in Eleanor's affairs. Miss Marple recalled his nervous reaction when the envelope atop the piano was mentioned, and the way he lingered on the discussion of the torn letter. There was a hunger there, not necessarily material, but perhaps for influence, control, or recognition, motives that could have pushed him into action had circumstances aligned. Yet greed alone could not explain all the contradictions she had observed. Eleanor's life was rich in affection and expectation, and she had interacted with multiple people whose emotions ran deep and varied. Jealousy seemed evident in the small, understated gestures of those who moved within the household. Clara, the housemaid, had been unusually tense in her accounts, her voice quivering not out of fear of punishment, but from an underlying sense of rivalry, perhaps even protective possessiveness. She had spoken of seeing Eleanor briefly in the drawing-room, but the hesitation in her words, coupled with her secretive glance toward Mrs. Whitcomb during questioning, suggested a complicated interplay of loyalties. Miss Marple wondered if jealousy, mingled with fear of reprimand or exposure, had created a situation in which a minor act of concealment escalated into a fatal outcome. Revenge also threaded through the tapestry of motive, subtle and deliberate. Eleanor's cousin Geoffrey had once been humiliated over a minor inheritance dispute, a grievance that lingered longer than one might expect. A distant slight, or even an imagined insult, could fester into intent when combined with opportunity and timing. Miss Marple considered that someone might have seen Eleanor's secret, correspondences, understood her plans, or misconstrued her intentions in a way that led them to seek retribution. Edward, too, though seemingly devoted, might have experienced bruised pride or hidden tension, small domestic grievances magnified by anxiety over the wedding. Miss Marple noted the cautious avoidance in his gaze whenever she questioned Eleanor's fears or the torn fragments of the letter, subtle cues indicating suppressed anger or unspoken frustration. Fear, however, was the most insidious motive, one that could drive careful, otherwise moral people to deception. Eleanor's own entries hinted at caution, secrecy, and foreboding, suggesting she had encountered someone who commanded attention, perhaps through threat or coercion. Miss Marple could see that fear had influenced the staff as well. The glances exchanged, the nervous hesitations, the almost imperceptible over-rehearsed stories. They were all consistent with individuals attempting to navigate a hierarchy of intimidation, whether real or perceived. Fear could twist loyalty into silence, caution into concealment, and hesitation into complicity. In combination with the other motives, greed, jealousy, revenge, it created a tangled web that no single theory could unravel entirely. Miss Marple began charting these relationships and possible motives in her mind, constructing a lattice of potential actions and consequences. Eleanor's interactions with Geoffrey and Edward revealed contrasts: warmth and trust on one hand, subtle tension and rivalry on the other. The staff, each motivated by loyalty, self-preservation, or private grievances, contributed additional layers of complexity. Clara's secrecy and nervousness could be protective, but it could also conceal curiosity that became meddling. Mrs. Whitcomb's insistence on perfection and her fleeting micro-expressions suggested she had witnessed more than she let on, perhaps aware of clandestine movements or overheard conversations. Lady Davenport herself, while grieving, was capable of influencing or misinterpreting events through her authority and familial protective instincts. Miss Marple's analysis required a careful sequencing of events. The torn letter fragments suggested secret meetings, likely at night or in moments unobserved by the wider household. The disturbed carpet fibres and the lace fragment indicated a presence near the piano, close to where Eleanor was found. The white glove, placed deliberately, pointed towards someone aware of Eleanor's habits, someone intending to direct attention yet conceal the actual deed. By combining these clues with the psychological mapping of motives, Miss Marple could begin to infer which interactions were genuine and which were artifice. She paused at the piano, placing the glove beside the lace fragment and reviewing the letter fragments again. It became clear that the motive could not exist in isolation. Each individual's reason to act was intertwined with the actions and inactions of others. Geoffrey's ambition intersected with Edward's anxieties. Clara's nervousness was influenced by Mrs. Whitcomb's authority and subtle warnings. Lady Davenport's intentions influenced the household's atmosphere, heightening caution or concealment. The crime was a nexus of intersecting motives, each amplifying or mitigating the others, forming a maze in which the perpetrator had carefully navigated to obscure the truth. Miss Marple then considered the subtle social cues she had observed. Geoffrey's glances, Edward's evasions, Clara's nervous shifts, Mrs. Whitcomb's guarded posture, and even Lady Davenport's occasional lapses of honesty, all were indicators of layered intention. The perpetrator was someone able to manipulate, intimidate, or influence the perceptions of those around them, using social dynamics as a tool to divert attention from their actions. Every lie, hesitation, and overemphasized truth was part of a larger strategy designed to conceal the true sequence of events. By late afternoon, she requested to revisit the drawing room with Lady Davenport. Walking slowly through the space, Miss Marple pointed out subtleties to the lady, not as revelations but as observations. The angle of the displaced chair, the faint smudge on the windowsill, the indentation in the carpet. Each was a clue that aligned with the labyrinth of motives she had been mapping. "You see, my dear," she said quietly, "the true intent behind what happened cannot be deduced from a single act. It is the interaction of desires, fears, and impulses that has created this unfortunate outcome. We must consider not only what was done, but why it could be done, by whom, and in what sequence. Lady Davenport listened intently, a pale nod of comprehension acknowledging the detective's insight. Miss Marple spent the remaining hours of the day cross-referencing statements and the physical evidence, mentally arranging and rearranging possibilities. The glove's placement suggested premeditation. The lace fragment implied proximity. The letter fragments hinted at concealed meetings. The witnesses' varied accounts, their subtle contradictions, and their fleeting micro-expressions painted a complex portrait of intersecting motives. At times, she allowed herself to imagine each scenario unfolding, testing them against the evidence, discarding those that failed, and noting which threads required closer scrutiny. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead once more, the manor lay in a fragile silence, the tension of the morning and afternoon echoing in its halls. Miss Marple's mind, however, was alive with clarity amidst complexity. The motives were tangled, yes, but not impenetrable. Each thread, greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, was a strand leading toward the person who had orchestrated events with deliberate cunning. The web of connections she had begun to trace formed a map of intention, and by following these intersections, she would draw closer to uncovering the hidden architect of Eleanor's demise. The investigation, though still unresolved, had entered a new phase. The motives, now charted and understood, would guide Miss Marple's next steps, revealing who had acted, how, and why. Every deception was intentional, every hesitation significant, and every piece of evidence a signpost pointing deeper into the intricate maze of human desires that had culminated in Lady Davenport's bride's tragic and enigmatic death. The following morning, the manor buzzed with an unusual sense of anticipation. The inspector had received word of a potential breakthrough, a scrap of paper discovered in the garden, partially buried beneath gravel near the rose beds, appeared to contain a confession or at least a critical clue. Word of this discovery had spread quickly, and the household was quietly abuzz with relief, thinking the mystery of Eleanor's death would soon be laid to rest. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant, her calm demeanour hiding a mind that had already begun to question the sudden turn of events. The scrap of paper was brought into the drawing-room with great ceremony. The inspector held it aloft, reading aloud in a voice tinged with triumph. "I saw nothing wrong. It was not meant to harm. I did what was necessary." A signature followed, almost illegible, scrawled in haste. The room's occupants murmured among themselves, relief washing over faces previously etched with tension. To the inspector, the mystery was solved. Geoffrey Renford had been summoned for questioning once more, and under the weight of this apparent evidence, he confessed to moving the envelope and, inadvertently, leaving the glove behind. It seemed to fit neatly into the narrative the authorities had been constructing. Miss Marple, however, noticed the subtleties that others overlooked. The handwriting, though hurried, was slightly inconsistent with Geoffrey's known script, and certain phrases seemed deliberately vague. She examined the paper closely, noting the type of ink used and the pressure applied to the pen. The lines were uneven, almost hesitant in places where a genuine confession might flow more naturally. A careful eye, accustomed to reading people as much as documents, might suspect that the scrap was planted, intended to appear incriminating while concealing the truth. The inspector, buoyed by this apparent resolution, was eager to move forward. He congratulated himself on the efficiency of the investigation, praising the evidence as the definitive turning point. Geoffrey, visibly shaken, nodded along with the inspector's praises, accepting blame, though his posture suggested tension and unease. Miss Marple observed quietly from the side, noting the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way the staff exchanged guarded glances, the way Lady Davenport's eyes flickered toward corners of the room as if uncertain what to believe, and how Edward Carstone's jaw tightened ever so slightly, betraying his private calculation. She took a seat near the grand piano, placing her hands lightly on the keys, though she did not play. Her eyes roved over the room, cataloguing every subtle expression, every half-conscious movement. Something did not sit right. The confession seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to satisfy the inspector's desire for closure. The threads Miss Marple had been following, the lace fragment, the disturbed carpet, the torn letter, and the interactions among the staff, did not align neatly with the new narrative. It was as if someone had constructed a false story, arranging pieces to fit an expected conclusion, while the true culprit remained hidden, watching carefully from the shadows. Miss Marple requested a private word with Lady Davenport, leading her quietly to the conservatory. "My dear," she said softly, "sometimes a solution that pleases the eyes and the heart is not the true solution at all. A confession, or what appears as one, can be as carefully arranged as a bouquet of flowers. It can mislead, conceal, or manipulate the outcome." Lady Davenport looked puzzled, but nodded, sensing the quiet authority in Miss Marple's words. "I understand, but if it is not Geoffrey, then who? And why would someone go to such lengths to stage this?" "Patience," Miss Marple replied, "is the most reliable ally in uncovering such a truth. We must observe and we must wait, for the real perpetrator often believes that the performance is complete. It is then, when the room relaxes, that their guard slips." Meanwhile, Geoffrey was escorted back to the study for further questioning, though the inspector had already declared him the primary suspect. His answers were careful, precise, and measured, but Miss Marple noticed fleeting inconsistencies, tiny hesitations before certain words, brief shifts in posture that suggested tension beyond mere guilt. It occurred to her that even if Geoffrey had played a role, perhaps as a pawn or unwitting participant, he was not the architect of the crime. Someone else had manipulated the situation, leaving Geoffrey exposed as the perfect decoy. The staff, emboldened by the apparent breakthrough, began speaking more freely, their earlier caution diminishing. Clara seemed unusually relieved, yet Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes continually sought Mrs. Whitcomb's, as though awaiting a cue or reassurance. Mrs. Whitcomb herself maintained a placid expression, but occasionally tensed subtly when the discussion veered toward Eleanor's final movements. Each reaction, each micro-expression, was a signal, a thread Miss Marple could trace, and each one suggested a carefully choreographed interplay of fear, obedience, and concealed knowledge. Miss Marple spent much of the afternoon reviewing the crime scene once more. She moved the glove across the piano keys, noting the faint impressions left on the wood. She examined the lace fragment, again, holding it to the light and observing the delicate fibres, the precise fraying that suggested careful handling rather than a struggle. She reread the fragments of Eleanor's letter, mentally overlaying the sequence of events she had reconstructed so far. Every piece of physical evidence pointed toward the conclusion she had been forming long before the discovery of the scrap in the garden. The crime had been orchestrated with deliberate cunning, and the confession that had so easily satisfied the inspector's satisfaction was part of a performance designed to divert attention. By evening, Miss Marple requested to speak once more with Edward Carstone, Eleanor's fiancé. She questioned him with her characteristic calm, probing gently into his movements, his observations, and his impressions of the household's dynamics. Edward's responses were courteous but carefully measured, yet Miss Marple detected subtle tension in the shift of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, and the occasional avoidance of direct answers regarding the torn letter fragments. His guarded demeanour suggested that he knew more than he disclosed, that he understood the broader dynamics of deception within the household, and perhaps recognized how the false confession served a strategic purpose. When night fell over St. Mary Mead, the manor was quiet once more, but the tension remained palpable. Miss Marple, alone in the drawing-room, reflected on the day's events. The authorities had declared a resolution, a tidy narrative that would please the family and satisfy social expectation. Yet she knew better. The threads of the crime, its meticulous arrangement, the subtle cues in the behaviour of the witnesses, and the contradictions she had catalogued over several days, pointed to a different truth. Geoffrey's confession was a carefully laid trap, or at the very least a convenient diversion, and the real criminal remained at large, poised in the shadows, patient and watchful. She placed the glove and the lace fragments side by side, considering the delicate interplay of evidence, motive, and human psychology. Each subtle clue, the faint ash pattern near the fireplace, the footprints leading to and from the rose beds, the fragmentary letter, formed a pattern, that did not align with the simplicity of Geoffrey's apparent guilt. The true perpetrator had created an intricate performance, leading the authorities to celebrate a false victory while remaining comfortably concealed behind layers of misdirection. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, tracing the maze of human behavior, connecting the inconsistencies, and anticipating the next move. Whoever had orchestrated the crime knew the value of patience, the power of suggestion, and the potency of a well-timed false lead. They would wait for the investigation to lull, for the household to relax, believing the case closed, before acting again or allowing the final truth to be revealed on their own terms. Outside, the night wind whispered through the manor's high windows, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves, as if echoing the quiet deception that still lingered within. Miss Marple, calm and resolute, understood that the coming hours would be critical. The false victory had been claimed, but the real criminal was still in the wings, watching and waiting. And she, ever patient, would ensure that when the moment came, the carefully concealed truth would finally step into the light. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with a lingering sense of unease. The false confession had quieted the household, yet in the hush she sensed an incomplete story, threads of truth still tangled and unresolved. As she walked the corridors, retracing steps she had observed before, her eyes lingered on minor details previously dismissed: the small indentation in the carpet near the grand piano, the subtle ash smudges by the hearth, and the faint impressions on the windowsill. These traces, when revisited with fresh scrutiny, seemed to suggest not a single act of desperation, but a carefully orchestrated sequence, one shaped by knowledge of the manor and its inhabitants, but perhaps not entirely new knowledge. She recalled a case from decades past, an incident that had occurred in a neighbouring county, long since closed and almost forgotten. It had involved a young woman of gentle disposition, a household carefully maintained, and an unexpected tragedy that had baffled local authorities. The particulars were different, yet Miss Marple noticed echoes: a household staff reluctant to speak fully, a family member whose presence loomed over proceedings, and subtle deceptions that, at the time, had gone unnoticed. There had been no resolution then, only conjecture and the polite silence of society. Yet the faint memory now resonated with the clues she had been observing at Lady Davenport's manor, hinting at patterns repeated across years and across households. She requested the inspector and Lady Davenport join her in the library under the pretence of reviewing Eleanor's personal effects, though her true purpose was to revisit the histories of the household's extended families. "Sometimes," she began, "the present is inseparable from the past. A careful observation of previous events can illuminate the truth that hides in plain sight today." The inspector nodded politely, though with a trace of impatience, eager to maintain the comfortable narrative of Geoffrey's supposed guilt. Lady Davenport, however, leaned forward, curiosity and concern etched across her features. Miss Marple began by revisiting the torn letter fragments Eleanor had left behind. The words "meet," "night," "trust," "danger" had seemed indicative of clandestine meetings, but now they also hinted at patterns of behaviour that extended beyond Eleanor herself. She asked Lady Davenport for further information about family connections, old grievances, and previous disputes. Slowly a web of interrelated histories began to emerge. Geoffrey Renford had been a frequent visitor to the estate since his youth, maintaining both amicable and tense relations with the household. Edward Carston's family had ties with the Renfords dating back decades, and there were lingering stories of prior misunderstandings, minor financial disputes, and long-forgotten romantic entanglements that shaped perceptions and behaviour across generations. Miss Marple's eyes then settled on the lace fragment she had examined repeatedly. In a sudden insight, she realized the pattern was not merely accidental. The delicate fraying at the edges, combined with its particular weave, indicated a style once popular in the late Victorian period, a style often preserved in the wardrobes of those who inherited clothing from their ancestors. Lady Davenport confirmed that some of the family's older garments, carefully preserved as heirlooms, were still stored in the attic, untouched but accessible. This detail suggested that the perpetrator had both intimate knowledge of these heirlooms and the presence of mind to use one as part of a carefully constructed scene. Miss Marple also turned her attention to the white glove, placed on the piano in plain sight. She recalled seeing a pair of gloves identical in fabric and style among the estate's historical collection. Only a person familiar with these possessions could have selected one so deliberately, ensuring that it appeared conspicuous, while simultaneously concealing the true source of evidence. The seemingly minor act of placement now revealed a deeper understanding. The crime was not spontaneous. It had roots in knowledge accumulated over years, the knowledge tied to family history, possessions, and unspoken rules of behaviour within the household. She requested to speak privately with Clara and Mrs. Whitcomb, asking them subtle, indirect questions about the past, about previous visitors, old disputes and incidents they had observed years ago, but considered irrelevant. At first, their answers were cautious and vague, but under gentle questioning, small details emerged, references to overheard conversations, forgotten disagreements, and fleeting observations of the Renfords' presence in the household over the years. These recollections, though minor, connected directly with patterns Miss Marple had begun to see. Geoffrey and Edward were not merely individuals acting in isolation. They were participants in a continuum of behaviours, decisions, and conflicts stretching across decades. Miss Marple then arranged to examine old letters and family records stored in the estate's archive. She discovered correspondence revealing minor financial disputes, veiled jealousies, and quiet resentments long smoothed over but never entirely forgotten. Some letters hinted at ambitions unfulfilled, others at perceived slights, and several contained cryptic references to trust and secrecy. Words repeated, in Eleanor's torn note. These findings suggested that the conflict leading to the present crime had not arisen spontaneously. It had been seeded long before, nurtured through decades of family interactions, misunderstandings, and unspoken expectations. The connections became clearer as she traced social interactions, both past and present. Geoffrey's movements, Eleanor's secret correspondence, and Edward's hesitations were no longer isolated anomalies. They were echoes of patterns established years earlier. The lace fragment, the glove, the disturbed carpet, all represented deliberate choices informed by historical knowledge of the household, its staff, and the social dynamics at play. Each individual's motive was layered not only with immediate desire or fear, but also with inherited grudges, learned behaviours, and familiarity with the subtleties of family interactions. Miss Marple paused to consider Lady Davenport herself. While outwardly composed and dignified, she had been an unwitting participant in these historical undercurrents. Her authority had influenced staff behaviour and the ways in which younger family members navigated the estate. Old grievances had been subtly reinforced by her actions, even as she sought harmony. Miss Marple realised that Eleanor's death, seemingly rooted in the present, was actually the culmination of decades of interwoven histories. A final outcome influenced by motives long buried but never fully resolved. As the day waned, Miss Marple requested a final consultation with Edward and Geoffrey together. She allowed them to speak of past events casually, drawing out memories of childhood visits, past disagreements, and familial tensions. Their reactions, micro-expressions, and half-conscious glances toward one another revealed an unspoken awareness of shared history, knowledge that informed their current behaviour, and possibly the orchestration of events leading to Eleanor's death. The connection between suspects was no longer abstract. It was concrete, visible in the patterns of speech, hesitation, and choice of words. By evening, Miss Marple returned alone to the drawing-room, reviewing the evidence and connections once more. The lace fragment, the glove, the letter, and the footprints were no longer merely physical traces. They were markers within a long narrative, linking the present crime to an ongoing pattern of human behaviour and familial interaction. She realised that the crime could not be fully understood without acknowledging the past, and that the perpetrator had relied upon both historical knowledge and contemporary cunning to stage the events that had so thoroughly misled the authorities. Outside, the light faded over St. Mary Mead, shadows stretching across the manor grounds. Inside, the atmosphere carried a quiet, almost haunted quality, as if the past itself lingered among the walls, influencing actions and hiding truths. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her notebook in, hand contemplated the maze of history and behaviour she had uncovered. The crime was no longer just an isolated event. It was a culmination of decades of interwoven lives, motives and secrets, and understanding this continuum was essential to uncovering the true culprit. She knew the real resolution would require delicate navigation, patience, and continued observation. The overlooked details, the subtle echoes of previous incidents, and the historical connections between suspects provided the framework for solving the mystery. Somewhere within the complex interplay of past and present, the truth awaited, patient, concealed, and ready to be revealed to those who could see beyond the obvious and recognize the enduring influence of history on human behavior. Miss Marple returned to the manor the following morning with a quiet determination. The day's light streamed across the drawing room, illuminating the faint impressions on the carpet and the delicate folds of the lace fragment she had examined so many times. The past and present were entwined in a complex web, yet she knew that the next step required a method less conventional than direct questioning. Facts and motives could only take her so far. To see through layers of carefully constructed deception, she would need to employ a tactic that played upon human nature itself. She had observed, over the course of the investigation, that people often betrayed themselves, not through lies, but through instinctual reactions, small gestures, brief pauses, micro-expressions that revealed thoughts they believed hidden. Miss Marple decided to turn this insight into a subtle psychological test. Rather than interrogate her suspects directly, she would craft a situation in which each might reveal what they truly knew about Eleanor's movements and the events leading to her death. The plan required precision, delicacy, and an understanding of social cues that she had cultivated over decades. She began with Geoffrey Renford. Miss Marple invited him to the drawing room under the pretense of reviewing Eleanor's personal effects, and asked him to assist in reconstructing her last known movements. She provided him with a small-scale map of the manor, carefully detailing corridors, staircases, and the location of key objects, but intentionally omitted certain inconsistencies she had noted previously. "We are simply trying to understand her routine," she said gently. "Perhaps you can help me see the spaces she frequented most often." Geoffrey leaned over the map, tracing paths with careful fingers. Miss Marple watched him silently, noting the subtleties of his body language, the slight stiffening of shoulders when approaching the back corridor, the hesitation in marking the rose garden near the rear entrance, and the quick, almost imperceptible glance toward the piano. Then, with casual observation, she introduced a minor detail into the discussion. She mentioned, in passing, that the envelope had likely been moved after Eleanor left the room, a statement she knew conflicted with the scrap of paper allegedly discovered in the garden. Geoffrey's response was immediate and involuntary. His hand froze mid-motion, and he stammered slightly before recovering. The pause, the subtle overcompensation in his voice, revealed a crack in the facade he had so carefully maintained. Miss Marple filed the observation quietly. Geoffrey had reacted to a detail that no innocent person would have found significant. Next, she turned to Edward Carston. For him, she devised a more tactile test. She presented 2 sets of objects from Eleanor's room, one set consisting of ordinary personal items, a brush, a book, a handkerchief, and another set containing objects tied more closely to the crime, the lace fragment, the glove, and the scraps of the letter. She asked Edward to arrange the items in the order in which he believed Eleanor had used them on that fateful evening. His composure remained impeccable at first, yet Miss Marple observed his micro-expressions, the brief tightening of lips, the flicker of hesitation as he reached for the glove, and a nearly imperceptible glance toward the lace fragment. While he completed the task without overt error, these small reactions hinted at awareness of details that, if innocent, would not have elicited such physical cues. Clara and Mrs. Whitcomb were approached differently. For them, Miss Marple employed a more conversational test, weaving small hypothetical scenarios into casual dialogue. She mentioned an imaginary visitor to the manor, someone who had been in Eleanor's room shortly before her death, and watched carefully as each staff member responded. Clara's hands trembled slightly, and her voice wavered more than once, betraying either fear or concealed knowledge. Mrs. Whitcomb, in contrast, maintained her composure, but repeatedly corrected minor details unnecessarily, revealing an unconscious desire to steer the narrative in a particular direction. Both responses, though subtle, indicated that neither woman was entirely forthcoming in previous accounts. Miss Marple's approach relied on the interplay between suggestion and instinct. She crafted conversations and exercises that placed her suspects in positions requiring judgment, recollection, or interpretation, but without direct accusation. In these controlled circumstances, true reactions, whether hesitation, overcompensation, or micro-signals of guilt, emerged naturally. By observing carefully, she could separate genuine memory from rehearsed deception. Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple staged a small gathering in the drawing-room, ostensibly to discuss minor details of Eleanor's correspondence. She casually placed the glove on the piano again, this time inviting Edward, Geoffrey, and Lady Davenport to inspect the arrangement of letters and personal effects. She watched as their eyes moved, noting how each person approached the objects, the order in which they glanced at items, and the subtleties of their reactions. Geoffrey lingered near the glove longer than necessary, his fingers brushing over the edges almost reverently before quickly withdrawing. Edward's gaze darted toward the lace fragment, followed by a faint tightening in his jaw. Lady Davenport, though composed, displayed fleeting discomfort when her attention was drawn to a previously forgotten scrap of letter tucked beneath a pile of papers. It was the combination of these small cues that formed the key to Miss Marple's insight. Each suspect's reaction, when placed alongside the others, revealed overlapping knowledge, information that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the immediate circle of events. The reactions were subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet they indicated that the true perpetrator had manipulated multiple individuals, knowingly or unknowingly, and had relied upon their assumptions and hesitations to obscure the central truth. Miss Marple reflected on the psychological tactic itself. By creating a situation in which the suspects were encouraged to interact with evidence in a low-pressure setting, she had prompted instinctual responses difficult to fabricate or suppress. A practiced lie can mask knowledge, but it rarely erases instinctive reaction. The brief pauses, involuntary gestures, and micro-expressions provided a map of awareness and involvement, pointing toward the individual whose composure concealed more than mere social etiquette or anxiety. Her observations coalesced into a singular understanding. One suspect had overplayed the narrative of involvement, subtly guiding others' perceptions while masking personal culpability. The previously discovered scrap of paper, the carefully placed glove, and the orchestrated confession were all part of an intricate performance, yet the psychological test had exposed the delicate crack in the facade. Miss Marple knew that, though the authorities were convinced the case was resolved, the true culprit had revealed themselves not through words, but through reaction, the unconscious truth betrayed in a moment of subtle imperfection. By evening, she had catalogued each reaction meticulously. Geoffrey's hesitation at the suggestion of posthumous movement of the envelope, Edward's slight physical tension around the lace fragment, and the staff's conflicting micro-responses all pointed to a central figure whose actions and knowledge intersected most consistently with the orchestrated elements of the crime. The unconventional tactic had succeeded, where direct questioning had not. It bypassed rehearsed stories and superficial compliance, exposing instinctive truths that could not be faked. Miss Marple, sitting alone in the dim light of the drawing-room, allowed herself a faint smile. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and obscured by deliberate misdirection, were beginning to align. The perpetrator had assumed the false confession and staged evidence would suffice to mislead, yet the careful application of observation and psychological subtlety had begun to unravel the performance. The next steps would require further patience and precise confrontation, but the unconventional tactic had provided the breakthrough Miss Marple needed. The first glimpse of a concealed truth, a subtle crack in the facade that, if pursued wisely, could lead to full revelation. Outside, dusk deepened, shadows stretching across the manor and merging with the quiet stillness. Within, Miss Marple's keen eye had discerned what others could not, that the crime's true architect, while still waiting in the shadows, had exposed themselves without realizing it. The stage was set for revelation, and the detective, armed with insight and patience, would soon follow that subtle crack to the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple had barely settled into her chair that evening, reviewing her notes from the psychological exercises, when an urgent knock sounded at the drawing-room door. The inspector entered, his expression a mixture of irritation and unease, holding a folder that had once contained the final pieces of Eleanor's correspondence. "I don't understand it," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "The final letters, the fragments we recovered from the desk, somehow they've vanished. The envelope, the notes, everything relevant to the last meeting, gone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The disappearance was no accident. The carefully orchestrated flow of events, the subtle reactions she had observed earlier, and now this vanishing evidence suggested deliberate interference. Someone within the household, or closely associated with it, was actively working to obscure the truth. The crime, she realized, had gained momentum precisely because someone wanted it buried before it could be fully understood. She immediately requested that the room be cleared, and the household assembled under the guise of an informal discussion about Eleanor's belongings. While the inspector scowled and muttered about the improbability of such a theft, Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, cataloguing potential motives for this new act of deception. Whoever had removed the letters had intimate knowledge of the household's routines, and more importantly understood what the authorities might rely upon as evidence. It was a calculated move to delay, mislead, and possibly redirect suspicion entirely. Miss Marple first turned her attention to the staff. Clara appeared nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she stood by the fireplace, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Whitcomb maintained her usual composed demeanour, yet Miss Marple noticed her eyes flicker toward the desk where the letters had once rested. "Someone must have had access," she murmured, aloud but softly to herself as much as anyone else, "and knew exactly what to take." The observation was subtle, but those, with knowledge or guilty conscience, tended to react, even when words were neutral. Clara shifted slightly, a tiny but telling movement, while Mrs. Whitcomb's fingers tapped briefly against her skirt, an unconscious signal of agitation. Miss Marple decided to trace the missing letters by following their likely path. They had last been seen in Eleanor's personal study, a room accessible only to a select few. She recalled the lace fragment, the glove, and the impressions in the carpet, all of which had indicated proximity and careful handling. Whoever removed the letters had done so with forethought. There were no signs of a struggle, no hasty footprints or displaced objects, only a clean, almost professional extraction. This was not the work of a momentary impulse. It was premeditated, designed to erase a link between observation and consequence. She turned next to Geoffrey Renford and Edward Carstone, arranging for a subtle re-examination of the manor's spaces. Geoffrey appeared cooperative, yet Miss Marple noted a small flinch when she mentioned the envelope, a reaction almost imperceptible, but consistent with someone who knew more than he claimed. Edward, meanwhile, tried to appear casual, but his attention repeatedly drifted toward the empty desk, betraying a mental catalogue of the missing items. Both men's reactions suggested they were aware of the letter's disappearance before it was publicly discovered, implying either complicity or prior knowledge of the thief's intent. The vanishing evidence raised more questions than it answered. Was this a desperate attempt to protect a guilty party, or a calculated effort by the true perpetrator to manipulate the investigation further? Miss Marple considered the possibilities. A staff member might have acted to protect a family member, or one of the relatives could have sought to remove incriminating details. The careful precision with which the letters were taken indicated experience and knowledge of how evidence could influence perception, an understanding unlikely to be possessed by a mere housemaid. Miss Marple's suspicions then turned to Lady Davenport herself. Though she had shown grief and composure in equal measure, she was also deeply invested in the family's reputation and in shielding her household from scandal. Could she have orchestrated the removal, or at least directed someone to do so? The notion was uncomfortable, yet the detective had learned that even the most dignified appearances could conceal practical, sometimes ruthless interventions when history, reputation, or fear was at stake. Lady Davenport's subtle flinches when the letters were discussed earlier suggested awareness of their contents, if not direct action. Miss Marple decided on a careful test. She arranged for a seemingly innocuous gathering in the drawing-room that evening, presenting topics about household management and minor historical disputes, while subtly referencing Eleanor's correspondence. Her strategy was to observe instinctive reactions under the guise of casual conversation. Clara's attention flicked repeatedly toward the empty desk. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice faltered slightly when the discussion touched on prior letters, and Edward's gaze darted, almost unconsciously, toward the location where the envelope had rested. Even Geoffrey's hands twitched briefly when she mentioned a document Eleanor had kept hidden. These micro-reactions formed a subtle network of acknowledgement, each indicating varying degrees of awareness or involvement. By late evening, Miss Marple had begun to reconstruct the likely scenario. The letter's removal was designed to create confusion, to delay the investigation, and to manipulate those who sought clarity. Whoever had acted understood that a missing piece of evidence could derail conclusions, giving them time to strengthen the facade of innocence. The act was both practical and psychological, leveraging absence as a tool, knowing that investigators often relied on what was present rather than what had disappeared. Miss Marple catalogued the remaining tangible evidence: the lace fragment, the glove, the impressions in the carpet, and the subtle ash marks by the hearth. Each indicated that the perpetrator had both foreknowledge and meticulous attention to detail. Whoever orchestrated the disappearance had to be someone with intimate familiarity with the estate, its inhabitants, and the predictable patterns of investigators. This narrowed the circle considerably, leaving only a handful of individuals capable of combining access, knowledge, and motive. The implications were chilling. The vanishing evidence had shifted the balance of the investigation, introducing new uncertainty and forcing her to reconsider prior assumptions. Trust within the household had become fragile. Those who were innocent could not be immediately distinguished from those with knowledge, complicity, or the desire to manipulate outcomes. Every glance, hesitation, and micro-expression could carry significance, and the detective realized that the next moves had to be deliberate and subtle, ensuring that the perpetrator could not anticipate her methods. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the night reviewing every observation, every interaction, and every piece of minor evidence previously catalogued. The theft of the letters, while alarming, also provided insight. The perpetrator had acted because the truth was dangerously close to being uncovered. By creating the appearance of chaos and erasing key evidence, they had revealed their awareness of investigative pressure and their capacity for foresight. The disappearance itself was a confession in action, a signal that the final unraveling of the crime's mystery would require greater subtlety, patience, and an acute understanding of human behavior. As the night deepened and shadows stretched across the manor, Miss Marple sat quietly, reflecting on the day's developments. The vanishing evidence had elevated the stakes. The crime was no longer merely a puzzle to be solved, but a contest of wit and insight, in which the perpetrator actively sought to bury the truth. Yet she remained undeterred. Patience, observation, and a careful reading of human nature would, she knew, ultimately reveal the unseen hand at work. The letters might have vanished, but the traces of knowledge, intention, and reaction remained, and they would guide her inexorably toward the revelation she had long anticipated. The following morning, a thick fog hung over St. Mary Mead, muffling the sounds of the estate and lending an eerie hush to the manor's grounds. Miss Marple, already deep in contemplation over the vanished letters, sensed a tightening tension in the household. Something was brewing, though its shape remained unclear. She had just finished reviewing her notes and arranging the clues from the prior day when a shrill cry shattered the quiet, echoing from the upper floors. Rushing up the grand staircase, Miss Marple encountered the household in disarray. Servants and family alike gathered near the west wing corridor, faces pale with alarm. Lady Davenport, her usual composure shattered, pointed toward the guest chamber. It's Clara," she gasped. "She's gone. The door was locked, and yet she's simply disappeared." Miss Marple's mind raced. A disappearance within the confines of a locked room was more than coincidence. It was an assertion of control by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate access and perception. The fog outside now seemed symbolic of the cloud of deceit surrounding the household. She requested that the door be opened and the room examined carefully, and the inspector, flustered, complied with obvious reluctance at being upstaged by the seemingly quiet old lady. Inside, the room was as orderly as it had been the previous evening. Clara's personal belongings lay undisturbed. Yet a faint smear of ash on the windowsill suggested recent activity. The curtains had been drawn slightly, and the window latch was locked, yet there were subtle scratches on the sill that indicated forced entry or exit by some agile hand. Miss Marple crouched to inspect the floorboards, noting a nearly imperceptible trail of footprints leading toward the adjoining service corridor. The tracks were small, precise, and deliberately misleading, an effort to imply someone had exited unseen, while simultaneously diverting attention from the true path of departure. The household erupted in speculation. Some feared Clara had fled in terror, others whispered of abduction or worse. Miss Marple, however, observed quietly, cataloguing the reactions of each individual present. Geoffrey's composure, though outwardly controlled, exhibited micro-expressions of tension, a slight tightening of lips, a shadow crossing his eyes when the possibility of abduction was mentioned. Edward's gestures were equally revealing. He avoided looking directly at the inspector, instead focusing on the faint trail of dust near the doorframe. Lady Davenport's anxiety was natural, yet Miss Marple noticed a flicker of thoughtfulness in her eyes, as though she were calculating possibilities beyond immediate fear. As the day progressed, Miss Marple employed a measured approach. She asked the inspector to gather all members of the household for questioning, ostensibly to provide statements regarding Clara's last known movements. She interspersed casual, seemingly irrelevant questions about routine tasks, laundry schedules, and meal preparations, details that might seem trivial, but often triggered instinctive reactions in those who knew more than they disclosed. Geoffrey's hands twitched when asked about the morning's cleaning arrangements. Edward's gaze darted repeatedly toward the west corridor, and Mrs. Whitcomb's voice carried a subtle tremor when describing Clara's supposed routine. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the window. Although locked, she noted the faint scratch marks in the wood and the displaced latch, suggesting tampering by someone familiar with its mechanism. She deduced that the perpetrator had intimate knowledge of the manor's architecture and routines. The disappearance of Clara was not an impulsive act. It was planned with precision, echoing the earlier theft of the letters. Whoever was orchestrating events was several steps ahead, deliberately manipulating evidence and controlling the narrative to maintain an advantage over the investigation. Later, while examining the room more closely, Miss Marple discovered a faint trace of powdered residue on the windowsill, likely from a burned matchstick or a small ash fragment. The type of ash matched that found near the hearth in the drawing room, suggesting that the same hand responsible for previous misdirection had once again acted deliberately to create a controlled illusion. It was a subtle but critical detail, indicating the criminal's presence and method, and offering a slender thread from which Miss Marple could begin to unravel the sequence of events. Meanwhile, the household's atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Speculation and suspicion circulated freely, straining relationships and eroding trust. Miss Marple observed these interactions closely, noting inconsistencies and subtle hints. Geoffrey's insistence on staying near the main staircase while discussing Clara's disappearance, Edward's evasive responses about his morning movements, and Mrs. Whitcomb's repeated corrections of seemingly trivial details all suggested that each was reacting to more than mere anxiety. They were responding to knowledge, whether partial or complete, of the perpetrator's actions. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple devised a subtle ruse to provoke further insight. She gathered Geoffrey and Edward in the drawing-room, ostensibly to review a minor historical discrepancy in Eleanor's correspondence, but her true aim was to observe instinctive responses. She mentioned casually that Clara might have seen something of importance before disappearing, leaving the statement deliberately vague. Geoffrey's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and he shifted in his chair while Edward's hand brushed briefly over the lace fragment left on the piano. The reactions, though fleeting, confirmed that both had awareness of details not yet shared with the authorities, suggesting proximity to the orchestrated series of events. By evening, Miss Marple had pieced together a preliminary theory. Clara's disappearance was connected directly to the same individual who had removed the letters. The pattern was consistent, premeditated, calculated, and psychologically manipulative. The perpetrator was testing the household, observing reactions, and maintaining control of the investigation's flow. The disappearance was a demonstration, a warning that even as Miss Marple probed closer, the criminal could intervene to obscure the truth or create new confusion. She considered the implications. The stakes had risen sharply. No longer was she merely attempting to identify a culprit or interpret hidden motives. The safety of the household, particularly that of Clara, was now at risk. The investigation required swifter action, heightened observation, and anticipation of the criminal's next maneuver. Miss Marple recognized that the villain, comfortable with concealment and deception, sought to maintain the advantage, creating new obstacles at every turn. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the evening reviewing prior evidence and reactions, cross-referencing them with the newly revealed circumstances. The lace fragment, the glove, the missing letters, and now the vanishing maid formed a continuous pattern, each linked by meticulous planning and knowledge of human behavior. The perpetrator was methodical, patient, and dangerously clever, relying upon instinctive responses to manipulate perceptions and misdirect the investigation. As night fell over the manor, Miss Marple walked the quiet corridors alone, considering the sequence of events and the psychological profile of the criminal. The unexpected twist, the disappearance of Clara, had elevated the urgency of the investigation. It was no longer enough to simply uncover the truth. She needed to anticipate the next move, protect the vulnerable, and confront a villain several steps ahead. Yet, in the stillness, she felt a familiar clarity settle over her mind. Each reaction, each trace of evidence, and each subtle clue provided guidance. The perpetrator had revealed patterns in their precision and obsession with control, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, would use these patterns to close the distance between mystery and revelation. Outside, fog thickened, curling around the manor like a living veil. Inside, Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes tracing shadows and outlines, cataloguing every memory of the day. The crime had taken a sharp, dangerous turn, but she was ready. The game was no longer one of deduction alone. It was a contest of wits, timing, and psychological insight. And she, as always, would not be outmaneuvered. Miss Marple awoke to a quiet morning, the manor wrapped in a heavy mist that softened the edges of the world outside. The disappearance of Clara had shaken the household, and the inspector was still floundering, insisting on following conventional procedures while missing the subtler threads that Miss Marple had been tracing for days. Yet, in the fog of confusion and fear, one thing became increasingly clear. There was a method to the apparent chaos. The sequence of disappearances, vanishing letters, and orchestrated reactions was not random. Somewhere, a pattern existed, waiting to be recognized. She began by reviewing the events chronologically, focusing less on the broad strokes and more on the minutiae, the tiny, almost imperceptible details others overlooked. The glove on the piano, the lace fragment, the faint ash smudges, Clara's movements before her disappearance, Geoffrey's sudden flinches, Edward's micro-expressions, and even the seemingly trivial corrections of the staff. All of these elements, when isolated, appeared innocuous or coincidental. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that in human affairs, repetition and subtlety often hid deliberate intent. As she traced her mental map of the household, one detail in particular resurfaced. A remark made in passing by Lady Davenport during the previous day's discussion of Eleanor's letters. She had commented, almost as an aside, that the gardener, though elderly, had an unerring sense of order and a memory for who moved what and when. At the time, Miss Marple had noted it as a harmless reflection on the staff's reliability. Yet now, in the context of vanished letters, the manipulated objects, and Clara's disappearance, it gained new significance. Whoever orchestrated these events clearly possessed knowledge of both access points and the precise habits of the household's occupants. Miss Marple requested to examine the drawing room again, taking a meticulous inventory of every object and its prior placement. The piano keys bore faint impressions where the glove had been laid. The carpet in front of the hearth still held subtle indentations where someone had lingered or knelt. She revisited the window from which Clara had apparently vanished, noting the scratch marks along the sill and the slight dislodgement of the latch. Each of these traces was minor, almost dismissible, yet together they began to form a narrative of movement and intention. The criminal's actions were deliberate, choreographed, and designed to mislead, yet they could not completely erase their own patterns. Then she remembered a small, overlooked habit of Geoffrey's, his tendency to tap the handle of a door lightly when he was uncertain or anxious. It had seemed nothing more than a nervous tic, until she realized that almost every instance when evidence had been tampered with, or when tension had spiked within the household, Geoffrey had displayed this exact behaviour. The tapping was so subtle that most people failed to notice it, but to Miss Marple, accustomed to observing human quirks, it was unmistakable. It was a signal, perhaps unconscious, that coincided with moments of orchestrated misdirection. Similarly, Edward had a habit of adjusting his cufflinks, twisting them slightly when he felt guilty or aware of hidden information. Miss Marple had observed it repeatedly during the stage discussions of Eleanor's personal effects. While on the surface Edward appeared composed, these tiny adjustments betrayed an internal calculation, a preemptive measure to maintain control over his own composure while manipulating the perceptions of others. Each subtle gesture, when plotted against the timeline of events, revealed the invisible hand guiding the chaos. Even the staff, seemingly peripheral to the main events, displayed behaviours that now made sense. Clara's nervous shifting and Mrs. Whitcomb's compulsive corrections were not merely signs of fear or propriety. They were reactions to cues they did not fully articulate, but instinctively understood. Someone had cultivated a web of influence over the household, ensuring that reactions could be predicted, that minor adjustments in behaviour could be leveraged to distract or mislead. Miss Marple took out her notebook and began drawing a diagram, connecting each individual's habitual gestures, prior movements, and responses to specific events. Lines intersected, forming clusters around key locations: the piano, the hearth, the windowsill, and the desk where Eleanor's letters had disappeared. The pattern became increasingly coherent. The criminal had acted in a way that capitalized on these predictable habits, orchestrating the sequence of misdirection with a thorough understanding of human nature. The final element fell into place when she considered the lace fragment once more. Its positioning, its delicate fraying, and its provenance all suggested careful selection, not by chance, but by someone intimately familiar with the household's historical possessions. The fragment was a lure, meant to draw attention while the true manipulation occurred elsewhere. Paired with Geoffrey's nervous tic, Edward's cufflink adjustments, and the subtle anxieties of the staff, Miss Marple realized that the criminal had not been working in isolation. They had been exploiting pre-existing patterns of behavior, ensuring that misdirection would carry the investigation away from the core truth. Suddenly, a minor inconsistency clicked into place. The timeline of Eleanor's last known activities did not align with the confessions and alibis provided. The discrepancy was small, barely noticeable, but in light of the behavioral patterns she had observed, it revealed something profound. The individual who orchestrated the theft of letters and Clara's disappearance had done so at precise intervals, ensuring that misdirection coincided with predictable reactions from each member of the household. The criminal had assumed that others' instinctive behaviours would shield their own actions from scrutiny. Miss Marple called for Geoffrey and Edward to join her in the library under the pretence of discussing household records. She spoke casually about minor discrepancies in the archives, observing their micro-reactions carefully. Geoffrey's hand brushed over the map of the manor with an almost imperceptible hesitation. Edward's eyes flicked to the lace fragment on the table. Each gesture confirmed what she had intuited. The pattern of manipulation had been designed around these small, overlooked behaviours, and now the connections were no longer abstract. They were tangible and actionable. In the quiet of the library, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The chaos, the vanishing evidence, the disappearance of Clara, and the prior misdirections were no longer random events. They were part of a deliberate sequence, orchestrated by someone who understood human nature, household routines, and the subtleties of misdirection. The key to the case had been hidden in plain sight all along, disguised as minor habits, instinctive gestures, and seemingly trivial observations. By the evening, she felt confident in her understanding of the web of deception. The patterns revealed who had the knowledge, the access, and the foresight to manipulate the household in the investigation. The chaos had masked the truth, but only superficially. Beneath it, the design was clear. Miss Marple knew that the final steps toward resolution would require careful confrontation, patience, and precise timing. But now she had the roadmap, the hidden, subtle pattern that had guided every twist and turn of the case. As darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors, noting once more the faint ash marks, the lace fragment, the glove, and the minor indentations in the carpet. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the truth became visible not in grand gestures, but in the smallest, most easily overlooked details, the very things everyone else had dismissed. And in that revelation, Miss Marple understood that the next move would be decisive, drawing the criminal from the shadows and exposing the intricate design that had ensnared the household so completely. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room that evening, reviewing her notes and reflecting on the pattern she had traced through the household. The web of small, seemingly insignificant gestures, the vanished letters and Clara's disappearance, had all pointed toward a single orchestrator, but the motive behind such meticulous manipulation remained shrouded. It was one thing to recognize the criminal's skill, but another entirely to understand the driving force behind the crime. Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous crimes often stemmed from desires deeper than money, revenge, or simple malice. Her opportunity to probe further arrived when Lady Davenport, sensing that the investigation was far from complete, suggested a quiet, private conversation in her private sitting room. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Miss Marple began by revisiting the relationships within the household, asking Lady Davenport to recount her recollection of Eleanor's behaviour and the personalities of those closest to her. Lady Davenport spoke with candour, noting minor grievances, fleeting jealousies, and a few peculiar habits of both Geoffrey and Edward. It was then that a subtle comment sparked Miss Marple's intuition. Lady Davenport mentioned, almost in passing, that Eleanor had recently grown unusually attentive to the family archives and heirlooms, spending hours in the study reviewing letters and documents dating back decades. She seemed fascinated, Lady Davenport said, as if she was piecing together a story the rest of us had forgotten or ignored. The statement, casual at first, resonated deeply with Miss Marple. Eleanor's interest in the past, combined with the intricate manipulation of the present, suggested that someone had feared the discovery of information that would expose not just a surface-level secret, but something profoundly personal, something that could not be explained away by ordinary motives. Miss Marple returned to the evidence with renewed focus. The lace fragment, the glove, the careful placement of letters, and the orchestration of reactions were not merely tools of deception. They were instruments designed to control perception and delay discovery. Whoever had committed the crime had acted not for greed or petty revenge, but to protect a secret so intimate, so psychologically charged, that exposure would have been unbearable. This insight reframed every clue she had collected, forcing her to consider the deeper psychology behind the orchestrated misdirection. She requested private interviews with Geoffrey and Edward, under the pretense of reconstructing Eleanor's last evening. Geoffrey, as usual, maintained a calm exterior, but Miss Marple noticed subtle tension in his shoulders and a faint quiver in his fingers when she referenced the archives. Edward, in contrast, appeared almost composed, yet his eyes darted repeatedly toward the lace fragment, betraying a preoccupation with its significance. Miss Marple probed gently, speaking about Eleanor's fascination with past events, her meticulous documentation, and the importance she placed on family history. Both men reacted in ways that suggested the truth they feared was tied to Eleanor's understanding of past events, not to any immediate financial or social advantage. It was a moment of quiet reflection that brought clarity. Miss Marple asked herself why the perpetrator had gone to such extremes, staging a false confession, removing letters, orchestrating reactions, and even abducting Clara briefly to divert attention. The answer lay in psychology rather than material desire. Eleanor had stumbled upon a truth so deeply intertwined with the perpetrator's identity and sense of self that exposure would have been catastrophic. This was not a simple crime of passion or a dispute over inheritance. It was a desperate effort to prevent personal ruin and the revelation of a hidden, deeply ingrained fear. Miss Marple then considered the peculiar obsession with controlling minor details, the careful positioning of gloves, The selection of a specific piece of lace, the orchestration of reactions. These actions indicated more than cunning, they suggested compulsion. The perpetrator was not merely concealing a secret, they were attempting to shape reality itself, ensuring that others saw exactly what they wished to be seen, and that no unintended truths surfaced. The psychological weight of such behavior revealed an individual willing to manipulate, deceive, and even threaten those around them to preserve the narrative of self that they could not bear to shatter. She confronted Geoffrey gently, revisiting his habitual gestures, the tapping on doors and his flinches at minor discrepancies. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "a person fears not what they have done, but what might be discovered. The smallest truth can appear catastrophic when it challenges the story we tell ourselves about who we are." Geoffrey's gaze faltered, and for the first time Miss Marple noticed a subtle tremor in his hands. He realized, perhaps unconsciously, that his psychological compulsion had guided every action, his manipulations, his evasions, his attempts at misdirection, all motivated by a profound fear of exposure. Edward, too, could not maintain composure indefinitely. Miss Marple spoke of Eleanor's meticulous research into family histories, her attention to heirlooms, and the subtle indications she had uncovered about prior incidents long obscured. Edward's habitual cuff-link adjustments became more pronounced, and he allowed a momentary flicker of unease to cross his otherwise controlled expression. The realization was clear. The deeper motive was not ambition, revenge, or simple malice. It was the preservation of self-concept and the concealment of truths that threatened identity, dignity, and the fragile narrative each had maintained for decades. Even Lady Davenport, though not directly responsible for the crimes, had unconsciously contributed to the pressures that had driven the perpetrator. Her insistence on propriety, her careful oversight of household routines, and her subtle reinforcement of hierarchical dynamics had created an environment in which minor secrets could balloon into catastrophic consequences if discovered. The criminal's extreme measures, though morally indefensible, were rooted in a profound psychological imperative to prevent the unraveling of personal history and identity under the scrutiny of both the family and the law. Miss Marple now had a full understanding of the hidden motive. The crime had been orchestrated with precision, leveraging fear, knowledge of human behavior, and intimate familiarity with the household. The perpetrator had acted not from a desire for material gain or social standing, but from a need to control exposure, to manage the perception of self, and to prevent the revelation of a truth so intimate that it threatened the very fabric of identity. The orchestration of the false confession, the theft of letters, the careful staging of gestures, and the disappearance of Clara were all tools in a psychological strategy, each calibrated to maintain secrecy and delay discovery. In the quiet of the evening, Miss Marple reflected on the depths to which human fear could drive action. Crimes of passion were easily understood. Crimes of psychology, however, required patience, observation, and insight. The hidden motive, once uncovered, illuminated not only the perpetrator's actions but also the profound complexity of human behavior. The lengths to which an individual might go to preserve self-concept, identity, and control. She knew that the revelation of this motive would transform the approach to the case. The detective's task was no longer solely about tracing physical evidence or observing micro-expressions. It was about understanding the human psyche, predicting reactions, and anticipating the steps of someone whose actions were driven by profound fear and intricate self-preservation. The crime, Miss Marple realized, was as much a battle of minds as it was a sequence of tangible events, and the hidden motive, once exposed, provided the insight necessary to guide the next stage of investigation toward resolution. Miss Marple had spent the morning reviewing every detail, every gesture, every inconsistency that had surfaced over the past days. The pattern was clear now, and the hidden motive had illuminated the mind behind the deception. The criminal was no longer merely a shadow manipulating the household from behind curtains and carefully orchestrated distractions. They were a tangible presence, vulnerable to exposure. It was time for the final confrontation, and Miss Marple planned it with the precision and subtlety that had guided her through every stage of the investigation. She requested that the household assemble in the drawing-room under the pretence of a discussion about Eleanor's archives. Lady Davenport, nervous but composed, agreed, as did Geoffrey and Edward, while the staff lingered anxiously near the edges of the room. Miss Marple arranged the seating so that all eyes were visible to her, all gestures could be observed, and all reactions could be carefully noted. She had chosen a neutral space, the very drawing-room where subtle clues had first revealed themselves, where the criminal might feel in control, yet be subtly guided toward exposure. The detective began casually, speaking of Eleanor's habits and minor details of the manor's possessions. She drew attention to the lace fragment, placing it on the piano in plain view. Geoffrey's eyes immediately flickered to it, betraying the unconscious reaction she had observed previously. Edward's fingers twitched toward his cufflinks, an involuntary repetition of the gestures that had revealed his unease before. Miss Marple, calm and deliberate, let these reactions unfold naturally, allowing the tension to build without overt accusation. Then she introduced the critical element of her trap, a reconstructed timeline of events that incorporated the vanished letters, the orchestrated disappearance of Clara, and the small manipulations she had observed in gestures and behaviours. She spoke gently but firmly, describing how Eleanor's last evening had unfolded, the placement of objects, and the likely movements of individuals within the household. Some details, she said softly, were so carefully arranged that only someone intimately familiar with both the house and the people who inhabit it could have orchestrated them. Geoffrey shifted in his seat, a flicker of alarm crossing his face, but he quickly attempted to compose himself. Edward's eyes, however, betrayed a deeper disturbance. He leaned forward slightly, a subtle but telling sign that Miss Marple's account had struck too close to the truth. She allowed the room to absorb her words, letting silence do part of the work. Silence often forced reaction, an instinctual confession, a nervous gesture, a slip of the tongue. Miss Marple then addressed the seemingly minor details she had catalogued over the days, the tapping of doors, the micro-adjustments of cufflinks, the precise timing of movements, and the careful manipulation of reactions. Each element was a piece of a psychological puzzle, a tool used by the criminal to maintain control over perception. When we consider the sequence of events, she said, her voice gentle yet unwavering, it becomes clear that someone deliberately guided the investigation, using instinct and habit as instruments to obscure truth. And yet, even the most careful orchestration cannot entirely conceal human nature. Geoffrey's hands twitched involuntarily, brushing over the edge of the table, and Edward's voice faltered as he attempted to speak. Miss Marple paused, allowing the tension to mount. The room seemed to shrink, the air dense with unspoken acknowledgement. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Edward. The missing letters, Clara's disappearance, the manipulated evidence, they were not acts of chance. They were acts of fear, designed to conceal something deeply personal, something that, if revealed, would have threatened the very identity of the person responsible. For a moment the room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Edward's hand brushed over the lace fragment again, more insistently this time, as though it were a talisman holding back exposure. Miss Marple spoke softly but clearly. It is not wealth, power, or revenge that drove these actions. It is fear. Fear of discovery. Fear that a truth hidden in plain sight would unravel carefully constructed lives. Fear, above all, that one small revelation could change everything. Edward rose abruptly, his composure cracking. You don't understand," he exclaimed, his voice tight with desperation. "You can't possibly know what it means. The truth, it's too much to bear." Miss Marple remained seated, her expression calm, observing the storm of emotion. She had anticipated this response. It was the culmination of all the psychological cues she had observed. The criminal had been led to this point by their own instincts, and now, under pressure, their carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Geoffrey attempted to intervene, a hand raised in a gesture of caution, but Miss Marple's steady glance silenced him. "Let him speak," she said softly. "Let the truth emerge naturally. There is no need to shield it from observation." Edward's breathing grew ragged as he paced a few steps, circling the drawing-room, eyes darting between the objects that had played such a critical role in the deception. Finally, Edward stopped, turning to face the assembly with a mix of defiance and despair. "I did it," he admitted, the words escaping before he could restrain them. "I manipulated the letters, orchestrated Clara's disappearance, and guided everyone's reactions. I thought I could control the narrative, keep the truth hidden. But Eleanor discovered too much. She was piecing together the past, and if the truth had come out, I could not bear it. I could not risk exposure." His voice broke as he sank into a chair, head bowed. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "And so you acted," she said, "using what you knew of human nature, of habits, of instinct to create confusion. You did not act from greed or malice alone, but from fear, and that fear led to a series of choices, each more desperate than the last." The inspector moved forward to take control, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "There is no need for haste," she said. "The confession is complete, and the pattern is now fully revealed. It was not chance, but careful observation, subtle psychological pressure, and the predictability of human nature that brought the truth to light. You may take him into custody now, with certainty that justice, in both comprehension and procedure, has been achieved." Edward remained seated for a moment, the weight of his actions pressing upon him, before rising slowly under the inspector's guidance. Geoffrey and Lady Davenport exchanged glances, relief, and lingering shock mingling in their expressions. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the subtle relaxation of posture, the easing of tension, and the shift in energy, as the household began to understand that the crisis had passed and the orchestrator of the chaos had been unmasked. As the firelight flickered across the room, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The case, complex and deeply psychological, had been resolved not through brute force or dramatic confrontation, but through careful observation, patience, and understanding of human nature. Each gesture, each hesitation, each minor detail had been a thread in the web, and by tracing them, she had guided the truth into the open. The final confrontation had been as much about the mind as the evidence, and it had succeeded without spectacle. Quietly, deliberately, with precision. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the gardens and grounds of the manor under a soft morning light. Inside, the household began to return to measured calm, the shadows of fear and uncertainty slowly receding. Miss Marple remained by the window a moment longer, reflecting on the human psyche, the lengths to which fear could drive action, and the quiet power of observation. The case was closed, the pattern revealed, and the final confrontation had secured both truth and justice, leaving the detective once again vindicated by patience, insight, and the subtle art of understanding human nature. The manor had settled into an uneasy calm. The confession had been extracted, Edward had been taken into custody, and Lady Davenport and Geoffrey had begun the slow process of returning the household to normalcy. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner of the drawing-room with a steaming cup of tea, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The careful observation, the subtle tracking of gestures, the reconstruction of events, each piece had fallen into place, and the criminal's fear-driven manipulations had been revealed. And yet, as the fog hung outside the windows like a lingering question mark, Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of unease. Something still did not sit quite right. It began with a small, almost imperceptible detail, a smudge of ink on Lady Davenport's favourite writing desk, which she had noticed earlier, but dismissed as a careless mark. Miss Marple's eyes, trained to see what others overlooked, lingered on it now. The smudge was faint but deliberate, as if a document had been hastily wiped away. It was accompanied by the faint scent of lavender, the same fragrance Miss Marple had associated with Eleanor's private papers, suggesting recent handling. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible, but the detective knew from experience that the smallest clue could overturn the most carefully constructed narrative. She requested a quiet moment with Lady Davenport under the guise of reviewing household routines. As she moved toward the private sitting room, Miss Marple observed the slight tension in Lady Davenport's posture, the way her hands pressed lightly against the arms of her chair, and the almost imperceptible hesitation in her voice when discussing Eleanor's final days. Nothing overt, no dramatic confession, but enough to indicate a concealed layer of knowledge. Miss Marple allowed her to speak freely, guiding the conversation gently toward Eleanor's study, her personal correspondence, and the recently confessed actions of Edward. "It is difficult," Lady Davenport said carefully, "to reconcile what has happened. Edward, he has confessed, yes, but there are things Eleanor found that perhaps none of us fully understood, things that might explain more than we realize." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle shift in tone, the cautious selection of words. She decided to test the boundaries of this revelation. "You suggest," she said softly, "that there is more behind these events than even Edward has admitted. Perhaps someone else, someone closer to the household's inner circle, knew more and acted accordingly." Lady Davenport's eyes flickered, the hesitation too brief for anyone untrained to notice, but Miss Marple recorded it carefully. Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple requested the inspector to bring the remaining key witnesses together, ostensibly to review the resolution of the case. Geoffrey sat stiffly, Lady Davenport composed yet reserved, and Mrs. Whitcomb hovered near the edges, her usual prudence tempered by curiosity. Miss Marple spoke of Eleanor's keen observations and Edward's confession, yet she did so in a tone that allowed room for response, for revelation. It was then that a sudden recollection struck her. The lace fragment, the glove, the vanished letters, all carefully orchestrated as part of Edward's manipulation, yet each time to create diversions. But the timing of certain actions, the specific moments when objects were shifted or reactions provoked, did not align perfectly with Edward's confessed movements. There was a slight but deliberate mismatch, as though someone else had been guiding the sequence from behind the scenes, ensuring that misdirection occurred at critical moments. Miss Marple allowed silence to fill the room. Silence was an excellent tool. It compelled instinctive reactions, revealing what words might conceal. Lady Davenport's gaze flicked briefly toward the desk, then quickly away, while Geoffrey's attention lingered on the lace fragment once more, his fingers unconsciously brushing the edge of the piano. Mrs. Whitcomb's composure remained intact, but her posture subtly mirrored Lady Davenport's earlier hesitation. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. The orchestration was not the work of Edward alone. She spoke gently, tracing Edward's confessed actions, the disappearance of letters, the temporary abduction of Clara, and the orchestrated reactions throughout the household. "All of these events," she said softly, "were executed with precision, but some timing remains peculiar. Edward may have acted from fear, yes, but was he ever entirely alone in guiding these actions?" The room shifted slightly, a subtle tension threaded through the air. It was then that Lady Davenport's composure broke, just barely, her hands tightening over the arms of her chair. I suppose there is truth in what you suggest," she admitted in a low voice. "Edward acted, yes, but not without influence, not without guidance. There were pressures, legacies, matters from long before we understood. Eleanor discovered things about me, about choices I made decades ago that I thought were buried." Her eyes, usually calm and authoritative, glistened with a mix of fear and resignation. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You are saying," she prompted, "that you intervened, that some of the actions attributed to Edward were shaped, perhaps even prompted, by your influence?" Lady Davenport nodded slightly, the admission almost whispered. I did not anticipate the extremes he would go to," she said. "But yes, there were instructions, suggestions, ways to keep certain truths hidden. I never intended harm, only to preserve the family, to prevent old mistakes from surfacing." The room fell into stunned silence. Geoffrey's jaw tightened. Edward, still present under supervision, looked stunned, his prior sense of control unraveling, as the realization struck him that he had been guided all along. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, observing the web of influence that had lain beneath the apparent chaos. The mastermind, it seemed, had not been the obvious criminal, but someone long perceived as protector, as guardian of propriety and family secrets, Lady Davenport herself. She continued carefully, tracing the subtle manipulation. The vanishing letters had been timed to coincide with Eleanor's discoveries. The temporary disappearance of Clara had served as a distraction, orchestrated from advice given by Lady Davenport, and the micro-manipulations that Miss Marple had catalogued had been subtly guided through her influence on Edward's decisions. Each layer, each thread of deception, had been rooted not in greed or malice, but in a desperate desire to conceal personal truths, to preserve the household stability, and to protect the legacy she had long maintained. Miss Marple's insight was quiet, precise, and humane. It is clear that fear and protection, rather than malice, shaped much of this orchestration, she said softly. But even well-intended manipulation can lead to tragedy when combined with fear and desperation. Lady Davenport's gaze fell, acknowledging the weight of her influence, while Edward remained seated, silent and chastened, recognizing that his actions had been both his own and subtly directed by someone he had trusted. The final revelation reshaped the understanding of the case entirely. The mastermind, so carefully hidden behind the veil of propriety, had guided the sequence of events, influencing the fearful decisions that ultimately led to the crime's execution. What had seemed resolved, Edward's confession, the removal of letters, the disappearance of Clara, was now understood as part of a more intricate design, orchestrated by someone whose knowledge of human nature, access, and authority had subtly shaped outcomes without immediate recognition. By the time the evening shadows lengthened across the manor, Miss Marple had reconstructed the full extent of the deception. The crime, once considered closed, had revealed a deeper layer, a human psyche grappling with fear, legacy, and the desire to preserve appearances, shaping actions in ways that neither Edward nor anyone else had fully anticipated. The last-minute twist, the revelation of Lady Davenport's guiding hand, tested her skill and insight one final time, confirming that in the most intricate human dramas the truth is rarely as simple as it first appears. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind at work, cataloguing reactions, motives, and influences. The case, with its final twist, underscored the complexity of human behaviour, the interplay of fear, psychology, and authority, and the subtle power of observation to untangle even the most carefully constructed webs. As the fog outside the windows slowly dissipated, the detective allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. Justice, insight, and understanding had triumphed, even in the face of unexpected revelation. The morning after the startling revelation of Lady Davenport's involvement, the manor seemed quieter than ever, yet an undercurrent of tension lingered like a shadow refusing to lift. Edward had been formally taken into custody, and the authorities had begun to sort through the implications of Lady Davenport's guiding hand. But Miss Marple, as ever, understood that justice was rarely delivered in neat packages. It was not only a matter of law or confession, it was about comprehending the full scope of motive, method, and manipulation. She began by reviewing the sequence of events in her mind, taking careful note of the minor details that had pointed to the ultimate truth. The lace fragment, positioned as a deliberate distraction, the glove laid to mislead, Clara's brief disappearance, orchestrated to divert attention at critical moments, and the micro-gestures, Geoffrey's door-tapping, Edward's cufflink adjustments, all formed a mosaic of subtle signals. Each clue, she realized, had been visible all along but required patience, knowledge of human behavior, and careful observation to interpret correctly. Most had overlooked them, eager for resolution, and thus nearly missed the deeper truth. Miss Marple convened a private discussion with the inspector and Lady Davenport, framing it as a recap to ensure clarity. She spoke calmly, her voice deliberate, as she traced each step that had led to the uncovering of Edward's actions and subsequently Lady Davenport's subtle manipulations. The truth, she explained, was never concealed in grand gestures or dramatic evidence. It was hidden in the small habitual behaviours of those around us, in the placement of objects, and in the way fear shapes human response. Every seemingly trivial action had its meaning. She gestured toward the desk where the ink smudge had first drawn her attention. "Consider this mark," she said. It was dismissed as insignificant, yet it indicated recent handling of documents connected to Eleanor's discoveries. Paired with the reactions of Lady Davenport and Geoffrey, it became clear that influence had been exercised discreetly, guiding Edward's decisions and shaping the outcome. Lady Davenport, though calm on the surface, nodded slightly, acknowledging that her own actions had woven an additional layer of complexity into the case. Miss Marple then turned to the more human elements, the gestures and instinctive behaviours. Geoffrey's door-tapping, initially dismissed as nervousness, had marked moments of misdirection. Edward's cufflink adjustments betrayed his internal struggle and fear of exposure. Even Clara's own minor movements, her fleeting hesitations, had contributed to the rhythm of the household that the criminal had exploited. "We often overlook such small signals," Miss Marple said, "yet they are the truest indicators of intention, fear, and involvement. One need only know where to look and how to interpret them." The inspector, who had initially grown frustrated with what he considered over-analysis, nodded slowly, recognizing the depth of insight required to connect these threads. He had focused on tangible evidence, believing the confession sufficient. But Miss Marple's explanation revealed a more intricate design, one in which psychology and manipulation were as critical as the physical acts themselves. "It is a reminder," she added, "that the mind of the perpetrator often leaves traces far subtler than fingerprints, and these traces can be decisive if carefully observed." Yet the question remained, what of Lady Davenport herself? While her involvement had been revealed, it was clear that her role was not of malice, but of guidance born from fear and protective instincts. Edward had executed the overt acts, yet her subtle manipulations had steered him toward them. Justice, in the legal sense, would attend to Edward's actions, but Lady Davenport's complicity existed in a grey zone. Miss Marple considered the human implications, the family legacy, the desire to preserve appearances, and the psychological pressures that had driven both men. In this sense, justice was complex, layered, and not entirely delivered through conventional means. Miss Marple called Geoffrey forward to discuss the final details, noting how his own actions and reactions had been misread by many as mere bystander behaviour. "You see," she said gently, "your gestures, however slight, were pivotal to understanding the timing and orchestration of events. Had you not unconsciously revealed the pattern through small movements, the ultimate truth might have remained hidden. In cases such as this, one must watch carefully, for the human element is as revealing as any object or document." Geoffrey's expression shifted from unease to quiet comprehension, a recognition of the subtle forces at play. She then addressed the broader implications for the household, pointing out how the interplay of fear, secrecy, and human psychology had shaped the chain of events. Clara, whose brief disappearance had been used to misdirect the household, returned to her usual duties under close supervision. The remaining staff, now aware of the intricacies that had led to the turmoil, began the slow process of re-establishing normal routines, yet the tension lingered as a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and perception. Miss Marple summarised for the inspector and Lady Davenport, detailing how each small clue, the lace, the glove, the smudged ink, the habitual gestures, had been overlooked by many. "In the end," she said, "the criminal's own nature provided the means of exposure. Fear, compulsion, and subtle manipulation revealed themselves not through overt confession alone, but through the actions, both minor and major, that each person displayed under pressure. One can only appreciate the mind of the perpetrator by observing these patterns, understanding the interplay of motives and connecting the unseen threads." The inspector nodded solemnly, acknowledging that this level of insight went far beyond standard police procedure. Lady Davenport, quiet now, seemed relieved and burdened in equal measure, realizing the consequences of her influence, even as she appreciated the thoroughness with which Miss Marple had unravelled the events. The household had been preserved, yet altered. Justice, in a sense, had been served, but the psychological truths lingered, unresolved in the hearts and minds of those involved. Miss Marple herself reflected on the delicate balance of human behaviour and morality. Edward faced the legal consequences of his actions, Lady Davenport the weight of her guiding influence, and the household a renewed awareness of the subtleties that could govern fate. Justice, she knew, was rarely absolute. It existed in degrees, layered between law, human understanding, and the perceptive observation of those capable of discerning hidden truths. In this case, she had ensured that each thread, each action, and each subtle gesture was accounted for, revealing the full tapestry of cause and effect. As the day waned and sunlight slanted across the drawing-room floor, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case, once tangled in deception, had been methodically unravelled, yet she also understood the lingering unease, the recognition that human motives are rarely simple, that fear and love, protection and manipulation often intersect in unpredictable ways. The criminal's methods had been exposed, and the hidden patterns revealed, but the subtle lessons of observation, psychology and human behaviour remained, quietly advising vigilance in all future endeavours. The manor settled into a fragile peace. Edward would face justice. Lady Davenport's influence would remain a moral consideration rather than a legal indictment, and the household would slowly regain its balance. And as Miss Marple watched the final shadows of the evening stretch across the familiar furniture, she knew that her careful attention to the smallest details, overlooked gestures, misaligned objects, and the faintest hints of human emotion had once again placed her a step ahead, unravelling a mystery that might otherwise have remained incomprehensible. The courthouse clock struck 9 as Inspector Pewbright stepped out into the cool night. The trial had concluded only hours earlier, the gavel's final crack sealing the fate of the guilty. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had been delivered. Reporters gathered outside the court, their notebooks eager to catch a final word from the man who had untangled such a dark web of lies. But Pewbright, ever private, offered them nothing. He simply adjusted the brim of his worn trench coat, lit a cigarette, and walked away into the drifting mist. Yet even as he left the courthouse steps, a nagging unease trailed behind him, like a shadow that refused to dissolve. The case was closed on paper, yes. The pieces fit. The jury had no doubts. And yet, one detail, a minor one, gnawed at the edges of his mind. The detail that wouldn't fade. It was something small, insignificant perhaps. To anyone else it would have been dismissed as noise, but to Pewbright it was a note out of tune in a symphony he thought he had mastered. During the final days of questioning, one witness, a quiet servant woman from the household, had mentioned seeing a candle burning in the library window on the night of the murder. The problem was simple. The library had no candles, only a gas lamp, one that had been extinguished before midnight. At the time, it seemed irrelevant. Perhaps she was mistaken. Perhaps the flicker of light came from a lantern carried outside. He had filed it away, buried under the weight of stronger evidence. But now, with the case concluded, the image returned with striking clarity. A light in a window that should have been dark, a flame where there could not have been one. A letter without an answer. The next morning, as Pewbright sat in his modest study, a thin envelope slid beneath his door. No address, no seal, only his name, written in sharp, deliberate strokes. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was brief, almost mocking. You solved the case they wanted you to solve. But the game isn't over. Look to the past, and you'll find the flame. No signature. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat yet cold, as though each letter had been carved instead of written. Pewbright stared at it, his cigarette smouldering in the ashtray beside him. A chill crept along his spine, not of fear, but of recognition. Whoever had written this knew the detail that haunted him. They knew about the flame. A mind that refused to rest. He paced the room, the sound of his boots echoing against the floorboards. Had he missed something critical? Had the trial condemned the wrong person? Or was this simply a cruel trick, some leftover fragment of the deception that had plagued the case? The official line was clean. A jealous rival, cornered by circumstance, had struck in desperation. All the evidence pointed that way. But Pewbright knew too well how evidence could be arranged, how appearances could be tailored to tell any story. And if there was another hand behind it all, someone clever enough to remain hidden, then the case was not closed at all. The city sleeps, the mystery breathes. That night, London slept under a veil of fog. Pewbright walked the cobbled streets, his thoughts circling like vultures. Each corner he turned seemed to whisper unanswered questions. Each lamppost seemed to lean toward him, casting shadows longer than they should have been. The murderer had been caught, the jury satisfied, the city safe. And yet, in the heart of the detective there was no peace. He had lived long enough with lies to know when one still lingered. He paused at the edge of the Thames, watching the water lap against the stone embankment. In its surface the moon shimmered like a broken coin, fractured and incomplete. That, he thought grimly, was the nature of this case. Incomplete. A new beginning disguised as an end. The case file sat closed on his desk, marked with the word "Solved" in bold letters. But Pewbright left it at the edge of the table, never locked away in the drawer. For he knew better than anyone. Mysteries had a way of resurrecting themselves. What appeared finished was often only the first act, and as the letter's final line echoed in his mind, "Look to the past and you'll find the flame," he realized that this was no taunt. It was an invitation. To what, he did not yet know, but it meant one thing for certain. The story was not over. A detective's burden. As dawn broke, Inspector Pewbright extinguished his cigarette and gathered his coat. The city would see him as the man who had delivered justice, the detective who had solved the unsolvable. But in the silence of his own heart, he carried the weight of another truth, unsure, unfinished, and burning quietly like the candle in that forbidden window. Somewhere out there, a greater hand was still moving the pieces, and until he found it, his work would never truly be done. With steady steps, he left his study and disappeared once more into the waking city, the echo of mystery trailing after him like smoke.